It was the change in colonial policy that would cause the relationship between England and her colonies to deteriorate to the point that they would descend into war. Because the Sugar Act was not generating enough revenue, Parliament in London decided to come up with a new means of raising money to support the military efforts and military defense in the colonies. What they came up with was the Stamp Act in 1765, which would require a tax to be paid, and proof that the tax was paid was in the form of a revenue stamp that would be placed on most printed paper in the colonies, including things like legal documents, wills, documents related to court cases, deeds, marriage license, newspapers, pamphlets, advertisements, even playing cards. This law, though, was different than the previous ones because this was the first direct tax on the colonists, the first time that the tax would be placed on those who used the goods rather than on the merchants who would just simply pass on the costs. The colonists were livid and immediately began protesting, long before the act itself even went into effect. There were impassioned speeches in various colonial legislatures, including one by Patrick Henry in the Virginia House of Burgesses, where he demanded the king's government recognize the rights of all citizens, including their right to only be taxed by their elected representatives. There was the formation of secret societies like the Sons of Liberty, who took it upon themselves to intimidate tax collectors, tarring and feathering them, driving them out of towns, and even destroying the stamps before they could be issued. There was the calling of a Stamp Act Congress held in New York in 1765, which had 27 delegates from 9 colonies who committed to passing a resolution that only the colonists' elected representatives could place direct taxes on them. And since the colonies had no direct representation in Parliament, Parliament could not tax them in this manner. But perhaps the most effective means of protest were the boycotts. Between 1765 and 1766, it became fashionable in the colonies to not purchase any article of British origin, even if it meant spending more money. With colonial imports limited, merchants in London began demanding that Parliament take action to restore trade with the colonies. By 1766, the Stamp Act had been repealed, and the colonists celebrated. But really they paid little attention to the Declaratory Act that Parliament had passed at the same time, which did state that Parliament had the right to tax and make any laws for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Because you still did not have enough revenue coming in to fund all the military efforts, Charles Townshend, a member of Parliament, proposed a new series of taxes. And since the colonists didn't seem to object to taxes on trade, his proposed Townshend Acts would place taxes on certain trade goods, import duties on a variety of products, including tea, glass, paper, lead, and even paint. The money raised would pay for the salaries of Crown officials, as opposed to having colonial legislatures, who often use the threat of withholding the payment of salaries to force appointed officials to do their bidding. Anyone who was suspected of smuggling under the Act would have their homes or businesses searched with the application of what was known as a writ of assistance, which, although it's vaguely like a search warrant, doesn't require any actual evidence of wrongdoing, and government officials could come back repeatedly harassing individuals until they found something. Naturally, there would be protest. John Dickinson of Pennsylvania sent a series of letters that were published in London newspapers, unsigned, of course. And these letters argued to the people of England that these Townshend duties were in fact taxation and not for the purpose of the regulation of trade, which the colonies agreed that Parliament had the right to do. And since no taxation without representation was seen as a central principle of English law, that meant the Parliament was violating the law. Although Dickinson's letters generated discussions throughout London, it's once again the boycotts, encouraged by what was called the Massachusetts Circular Letter, sent out to all of the colonies, that encouraged the colonies to plead for repeal, and of course in the meantime to boycott British goods, and to encourage the smuggling of goods from outside of the British Empire. It's that economic boycott, that economic dispute that is going to have the most effect. Imports from Britain plummeted, and London merchants once again were demanding relief. But Parliament didn't give in right away. In 1770, the new Prime Minister, Lord Frederick North, finally called for their repeal, saying that these Townshend Acts were damaging to trade. And Parliament finally agreed, and all were repealed, except for a tax on tea, which was left in place as a symbol of Parliament's right to tax the colonists. After the Townshend Acts had been repealed, but before the colonists actually knew about it, in March of 1770, a group of Bostonians gathered near the customs house, the tax collector's house, wanting the customs official there to be sent out to be confronted by the mob and possibly to be tarred and feathered. A contingent of soldiers protecting the house faced off against those colonists, and when someone shouted fire, soldiers did. 5 colonists were killed, with at least 6 more wounded. The soldiers were arrested and tried in the city of Boston for murder. But they were acquitted when their defense attorney, future President John Adams, was able to produce numerous witnesses who swore that it had not been the commander who had given an order to fire, and that the crowd was not just a peaceful group of people walking on the street asking to meet with the customs official, but were in fact an angry mob. They weren't just casual protesters. They weren't just out for an evening walk, as many of the newspapers had depicted. And so, all of the men involved were acquitted of murder. After the Boston Massacre, the years through 1772 represented a bit of a break from the political trouble, and the colonies entered a period of economic prosperity. But during this time, some colonists, men such as Samuel Adams, who was actually a cousin to John Adams, tried to keep alive the view that British officials were deliberately conspiring against colonial liberties. And they began what were called committees of correspondence. These started in Massachusetts, and basically what they were is they exchanged letters describing any suspicious or potentially threatening British actions, so that the colonists themselves, regardless of where they lived in Massachusetts, could be informed of what the British were up to. Essentially, this was kind of like a spy network on British officials, and in particular the military. It wasn't long before the idea spread to the other colonies, and they had their own committees of correspondence. And then those even merged into what were called intercolonial committees, which allowed for communication between colonies, reporting on the same thing, so that people in Charleston, South Carolina could know what was happening in Philadelphia, who could know what was happening in Boston. With increasing numbers of presses in the colonies, and weekly newspapers, the public could easily keep track of what was happening from all over the colonies and even all over the world. And one of the things that these committees often did is they encouraged Americans to reduce their consumption of British goods, essentially slowly starting a bit of a boycott again. In June of 1772, though, this respite from trouble came to an end, when a British customs ship that was in pursuit of a ship believed to be carrying smuggled goods was lured onto a sandbar off the coast of Rhode Island. Stuck, it was unable to travel, and in the middle of the night, a group of colonists boarded the ship and burnt it to the waterline. British government officials investigated to see if they could find who was responsible so that they could be brought to justice, but never could, though it was strongly suspected that it was members of the Sons of Liberty. And since this was a secret society, they would not identify any of their members or identify anyone who had participated. This just added to the increasing anger of the king that the colonies were defying his orders. In the spring of 1773, Parliament passed a law regarding the East India Tea Company in an effort to save it from bankruptcy. The law would allow the East India tea to be imported into the colonies without any duties whatsoever from London, other than the tax on tea that was paid in the colonies themselves. This would actually make East India tea cheaper than even smuggled tea. But still the colonists didn't purchase it, objecting to Parliament's declaration that they had the right to tax them. And so the tea sat, and it sat in warehouses unsold. The link you see here gives a nice little overview and will be in the description box of the video. I strongly recommend you take a look. In December of 1773, 3 additional East India ships loaded with tea arrived in Boston Harbor. But the warehouses weren't buying the tea because merchants weren't selling it, so it had already piled up in the warehouses and they were full. And so the tea on board these ships sat and would be required to pay for the tax within 10 days. Hearing of this tea sitting in the harbor, members of the Sons of Liberty disguised themselves as Native Americans, boarded the ships, and dumped 342 chests of tea, approximately 18,000 pounds sterling worth, dumping it all into Boston Harbor. Today, that approximately 45 tons of tea would likely be worth more than $1 million today. Many supported these actions as a justifiable defense of colonial liberties, but others felt that this went too far because this was destruction of private property. Because the government didn't yet own the tea. They hadn't yet seized it. At the time, the government had simply given an advantage to the tea owned by this particular company. Still, several months later, there would be a second, much smaller tea party, repeated in Boston, and there would even be a few symbolic copycat tea parties held in places like South Carolina and Maryland and even New York.